was France, Great Britain, I think it was Great Britain and Germany and Russia, and of course, we were not really signatories to it, but we were co-sponsors, if you will. We were backing it. And 2014, when this crisis first began, 14,000 people were killed in that area. And the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe has reported very clearly that all of this was started not by Russia, but by the new Ukrainian government. Now, over time, it became very clear that some solution had to be found to avoid expanding this war, and that is one of the reasons why the Minsk Accords were drafted, and they were simply drafted with the goal in mind of providing equal rights before the law for the Russians in eastern Ukraine and putting an end to the violence and the killing. This unfortunately never occurred, and now we know from the statements from Chancellor Merkel in December of last year and more recently from President Macron that these agreements were in fact a fraud. That these agreements were designed to simply buy time for Ukraine while we poured billions of dollars in extraordinarily good modern equipment and training into the Ukrainian armed forces, specifically the army.
Can I interrupt you?
Yes.
You can explain to the audience about who drafted the accord and who were signatories to it.
Well, it was France, Great Britain, I think it was Great Britain and Germany and Russia, and of course, we were not really signatories to it, but we were co-sponsors, if you will. We were backing it.
And the Ukrainian government
refused
to ratify it. It was voted on, I believe, by the citizens of Donbass.
Yes, I mean, this was everything that was contained in those accords was acceptable to Russia and acceptable to the citizens of Ukraine who were Russians. Unfortunately, there was never any intention to impose any of it.
Let me interrupt you one more time, because I don't want to spoil your trip. I want you to
understand.
I think it's important to establish, because the Minsk Accords show what Russia at that point was willing to settle for. So that's, if you look at this current military exercise, which has now killed 300,000 Ukrainians, it's almost unimaginable that at the end of this, they're going to get back. The Ukrainians are going to get back, but it could have gotten just a signature on that agreement. As my understanding is, that it was that NATO would not move into Ukraine, that I believe that the missile launchers that we have in Ukraine would be removed, that the people of the ethnic Russians in the eastern Ukraine, that some of that would be in autonomous regions within Ukraine, so it would continue to be part of Ukraine, but the people would have some rights.
Well, you're talking about something that the Russians were willing to accept, which is effectively a multi-ethnic, multinational state, which is not a new development in Europe. We've had them over the centuries. Austria-Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Tsarist Russia were all multinational states. So there was no interest on Russia's side in breaking up Ukraine. Far from it. They were happy to have it intact. Now, this, of course, does not address Crimea. And at the time, they were Hungary, Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Tsarist Russia were all multinational states. So there was no interest on Russia's side in breaking up Ukraine. Far from it. They were happy to have it intact. Now, this, of course, does not address Crimea. And
it doesn't matter who you are. Having rational, biological understanding of
this is MC Colax.
They were unwilling to address Crimea because, from their standpoint, with considerable justification, the majority of people in Crimea are Russians and wanted to be part of Russia, but more important, it had been part of Russia since 1776. And it was an accident of history created by our friend Khrushchev in a drunken stupor that changed the hands of Crimea and put it in the camp of Ukraine. Bottom line is, there was no interest in the West, in Washington, London, Paris, Berlin, in changing anything that would benefit Russia, certainly not changing what they had planned for Ukraine. And by the time you reach December of 21 and January of 22, it's very obvious to the Russians that this force that has grown up in eastern Ukraine is actually very formidable, well-trained, well-equipped, and was poised, frankly, to attack those two breakaway provinces with the goal, ultimately, of retaking Crimea. So from their vantage point, this was a preemptive strike to prevent that war from breaking out. And for those who say, well, this is evidence for Russia's desire to expand and rebuild the Soviet Empire, we ought to keep something in mind. When the Russians went in, they went in with a remarkably small force. Ukraine's the size of Texas. They went in on the ground with 90,000 combat troops. The Ukrainians, of course, put up fierce resistance because they were already present and ready to fight. But most important, Moscow seemed to think that once this began, there was a willingness in the West to become serious and finally negotiate an arrangement. And it took several months for Mr. Putin and his colleagues in the Kremlin to realize no one wants to talk.
Yo, this
There
is
will be
MC
no
Cobra,
negotiations.
aka Mr.
And you'll
Tick Tick
recall that in
Tock,
April,
C4,
Boris
Semtex, Black,
Johnson, the
Black,
Prime Minister,
Black,
flew to Kiev and essentially told Zelensky, don't negotiate with these people. We'll provide you with whatever you need. We'll stick with you until you win. And of course, in March, that's exactly what President Biden said. So they wanted to stop any potential movement that would have resulted in some sort of compromise, particularly a compromise that would have made Ukraine neutral. And of course, neutrality is always very attractive. Austria was made neutral in 1955, and in large part because Eisenhower was anxious to make more states neutral in Europe, because he said we can't possibly protect them all. Well, here we are now, insisting that nothing can be neutral. Everything must belong to NATO, and it has to happen on our terms. This is something Russia can't accept, and so the Russians decided, well, now we're at war. We're going to have to go over to the defense, build up our forces, and prepare to end this war on our terms. And that's essentially what you watched since late September, October, Russia on the defense, while Ukrainians launched countless counterattacks against them. And this has turned out to be a catastrophe for the Ukrainians. They've lost, as you point out, over 300,000 dead. The Russians, in contrast, contrary to what the mainstream media says, have had perhaps 30,000 killed and perhaps 40 or 50,000 more wounded. But the difference between the Ukrainian wounded and Russian wounded is profound. The Russians rapidly evacuate people, and most of the wounded